Previously on Same Name, Different Game.
Have a safe and happy Halloween, and I'll see you next time.
Kept you waiting, huh?
I want the freshest cat possible.
5 years ago, it was the 25th anniversary of the Metal Gear series debut, and I did an episode on the first game in that series for the NES and the MSX2 home computer. And then, I planned and even announced a follow-up in which I would discuss Metal Gear Solid. And it never happened. But it's happening now. I'm Joe, and welcome to Same Name, Different Game. It's now the 30th anniversary of the debut of the Metal Gear series, and next year is the 20th birthday of Metal Gear Solid. So what better time to take a look at Hideo Kojima's breakout hit and the third or possibly fourth entry in the Metal Gear series? Metal Gear Solid. So hey, let's infiltrate the enemy base for a little history.
This series needs no introduction, and I have discussed the first entry in this series at length, but let's go beyond that. After Metal Gear became something of a surprise hit for Konami under their Ultra Games label in North America, a sequel was released exclusively on this side of the Pacific in the form of Snake's Revenge. Made without any input from the driving creative force behind Metal Gear, Hideo Kojima, the game is more than a bit of a mess, and infamously, after running into a guy working on it on the train home from work, Kojima was inspired to make his own direct sequel, ignoring Snake's Revenge. In a 2005 interview with Stephen Kent, Kojima stated,
"When I was in this MSX division, this one guy in the Famicom division developed Snake's Revenge without talking to me or anybody else. One day this guy and I hopped on a train together. We were talking to each other and he says, 'By the way, I'm developing this game called Snake's Revenge, but I know it's not the authentic Snake, so please create a new Snake game of your own.' That was when I decided to create Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake."
Both Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake and Snake's Revenge were released in 1990. The MSX2 was a home computer format that was not very popular outside of its native Japan, so that game wasn't localized at the time. Snake's Revenge was aimed at and subsequently only hit the North American market, so it would be 8 years before any place on Earth would see a new Metal Gear.
Development on what was initially known as Metal Gear 3 began in 1994, as Kojima's previous project, Policenauts, wrapped. It was originally slated for the 3DO, but after the abject failure of that system, it quickly moved over to the PlayStation. The name also quickly moved over, as Konami and Kojima wanted to make this game a huge international blockbuster, and since Metal Gear 2 hadn't been released outside of Japan, they didn't want to confuse the audience. The game was given a massive budget and received a huge marketing push from Konami, who clearly had faith in Hideo Kojima and his team, despite the fact that Kojima hadn't yet had a breakout hit worldwide. Still, their faith was clearly well placed because the hype train was running at full speed following the initial unveiling of the game at E3 1997, and the game went on to earn a frankly ridiculous number of accolades from critics and players, and sell a boatload of copies.
And of course spawn even more sequels and spin-offs. So let's start with the original Metal Gear Solid on the Sony PlayStation. This game was released on September 3rd, 1998 in Japan, October 21st, 1998 in North America, and early 1999 in PAL territories. It's the game that made Hideo Kojima famous.
Metal Gear Solid takes place several years after the original Metal Gear, the fall of Outer Heaven, and the defeat of Big Boss. And while a large portion of the audience knew little to nothing of Metal Gear 2, several of those events are referenced here as well, particularly as it pertains to the Cyborg Ninjas storyline. In Metal Gear 2, Snake traveled to Zanzibar to destroy a new Metal Gear and defeat Big Boss once again, presumably killing him. Kind of. Sort of. It's hard to explain. Stories in these games are really weird. At any rate, Snake is pulled out of retirement a second time. His old commander, Colonel Roy Campbell, very clearly inspired by Richard Crenna's portrayal of Colonel Sam Troutman in the Rambo films, finds Solid Snake living in a small cabin in the Alaskan wilderness, and convinces him to come take out his former unit Foxhound, who have gone rogue and become terrorists, demanding the remains of Big Boss. They're led by Liquid Snake, who is backed up by Revolver Ocelot, Vulcan Raven, Psycho Mantis, Sniper Wolf, and Decoy Octopus. The game takes place on Shadow Moses Island off the coast of Alaska. It's supposedly a nuclear disposal facility where warheads are dismantled, but that turns out to just be a cover, as the facility is a hangar housing the new model of Metal Gear. Foxhound and an army of genetically modified genome soldiers now hold the facility. Solid Snake's initial mission is to infiltrate the base and save two hostages: Donald Anderson, the chief of the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, which is a real thing, and Kenneth Baker, the president of US military arms contractor ArmsTech, which is a fictional thing. That mission does very quickly change, and he's tasked with enlisting the assistance of Hal Otacon Emmerich, an engineer on the latest Metal Gear, to disable and destroy the tank. Colonel Campbell's niece, Meryl Silverberg, is also at the facility and partners up with Snake to help complete the mission. Otacon makes a fairly dramatic entrance to the series by peeing his pants. So that's a thing. Meryl, on the other hand, is actually a fairly capable soldier who assists Snake in some firefights. As ever, Snake isn't given any equipment besides his Kodak communicator and Soliton radar with which to accomplish the mission. He must acquire all other tools on site, so no trace of his presence will be left. Snake can run, crawl, punch, choke, and snap necks in order to get weapons, and soon enough, we'll have all manner of arms, from a pistol and a machine gun to a gas mask and thermal goggles. Series veterans may find it odd that in this game you can't aim in first person and are given no non-lethal methods of incapacitating your enemies aside from punching, kicking, and throwing them. While later games reward the player for not killing, this game does not. And in fact, due to some sequences where the player is forced to shoot enemy soldiers, it's impossible to do a non-lethal run of this game. Just the same, the systems most players are familiar with from later games are in place here. Snake has a radar that shows enemy locations in his immediate area, along with their cone of vision. He can use one weapon and one item at a time. He can also melee attack even when he has a weapon equipped. The game feels like most of the Metal Gear games we've known over the past 3 generations.
And that's the problem with revisiting it today, if I'm being honest. It has a lot of the elements of those later games, but lacks the refinement.
Without first-person aiming, the shooting here is a bit wonky, especially against some of the bosses, though overall the boss fights are a strong point here, as they often are in this series, emphasizing the use of different tools and tactics in each. And while this game uses the overhead view of the earlier 2D games, it feels very zoomed in here compared to those, limiting the player's field of vision. You don't realize how much you miss the over-the-shoulder camera instituted with the re-release of Snake Eater until you go back to this. And if you're like me, you'll catch yourself trying to adjust the camera with the right analog stick out of habit, even though it does nothing here. It's hard to overstate what a technological advancement this was at the time, however, the visuals haven't aged super well. When the standard for a beautiful game was Resident Evil or Final Fantasy VII with their pre-rendered backgrounds, to see a huge environment like this rendered in real-time 3D assets was frankly mind-blowing, but playing it now, upscaled to 1080p, you can see the seams, and holy catfish, the dithering on everything here is a bit of an eyesore, while the 6th generation sequels have up-resed very nicely on modern systems and displays. Though in one area, I will say the game exceeds its follow-ups: the music. Kojima's obsession with cinema led him to enlist the services of Harry Gregson Williams, a Hollywood composer, to score the later titles, but in my opinion, the music here by members of the famed Konami Kukeiha Club is much better. It's more catchy, more memorable, and less like a bland score to a mid-tier Hollywood thriller. Metal Gear Solid for the original PlayStation is a very important game, but there is one important part of it that I have not yet touched on: the politics. This is the first game that I remember being a big budget blockbuster title that is explicitly political. Now, in the modern gaming climate, there are a lot of people who claim to not like politics in their games, and they'll often point to things like the inclusion of main characters of certain races or backgrounds, but they don't seem to mind that Metal Gear Solid has always been explicitly political. I find this baffling because, man, this game has things to say about US interventionism abroad, about nuclear proliferation, about the military-industrial complex, about the misuse of science in the name of building better weapons, about torture, about human rights, about jingoism. This game is explicitly political, and it's about as subtle as a sledgehammer, unfortunately. While I think Kojima's venturing into the subject matter is laudable, he's not a very good writer. That is to say, he's bad at writing dialogue, or maybe I should say he's bad at editing himself.
You like Castlevania, don't you?
The general rule of good cinematic storytelling, which I think extends to video games, is to show, not tell. And Kojima does way too much telling. While the later games, especially MGS4, are rightly taken to task for having too many cutscenes that are too long, this stuff was definitely here from the beginning. The action is too frequently interrupted for expository codec conversations that last way too long. Fortunately, Jeremy Blaustein's localization is very solid, and a professional voice acting cast, something of a rarity in 1998, makes listening to the dialogue fairly pleasant. And overall, the game continues to be enjoyable, if not a bit dated. Now, at the time in 1997, there were rumors and discussion of a port to the Nintendo 64. That never happened, but the game did eventually land on a Nintendo system of that generation. Kind of. Let's talk about Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color. Released in April of 2000 across North America, Japan, and Europe, the game was known as Metal Gear Ghost Babel in its home territory, but Metal Gear Solid everywhere else. This was perhaps not the best name for it, as the game is completely different from the PlayStation game of the same name, hence its inclusion on this show. It certainly has similarities, and Kojima did have input here, unlike Snake's Revenge, but developed by prolific contract developer Tosei and headed up by Shinta Nojiri at Konami, who would go on to make the Metal Gear Acid games for the PSP, it lacks the polish of the PS1 title. This non-canon entry to the series ignores Metal Gear 2 and the events in Zanzibar while acting as a kind of alternate reality version of Metal Gear Solid. Snake is still retired and living in Alaska when Colonel Campbell comes knocking. Snake still falls squarely into the best X whatever action movie trope, so naturally he's pulled back into service, this time to head to the Central African nation of Gindra so he can stop a military junta who has stolen the latest Metal Gear model from using it on targets in the US and elsewhere. Gindra also, as it turns out, is the new name of the territory once known as Outer Heaven. So in goes Snake in the usual manner, without equipment, and this time with a different supporting cast. The only characters recurring here are Mei Ling, who you call to save your game in both versions, and Colonel Campbell. Meryl is replaced with a Delta Force soldier named Chris, who basically fills the same role. And Otacon is replaced with Jimmy, an obnoxious 18-year-old wunderkind in the field of robotics. Imagine Otacon, but like even more obnoxious. But without the pants peeing part.
And there's kind of an explanation for this? Okay, bear with me. If you finish the game again using the special mission parameters, which is something that only appears in the post-game, at the end of all that, you will get a message from someone talking about this being a VR training exercise for someone named Jack. Now, it's largely believed that this is a reference to Metal Gear Solid 2, which was in development at the time. Kojima's never confirmed it, but the pieces do seem to fit, because in Metal Gear Solid 2, they talk about Raiden, aka Jack, and his training being VR recreations of incidents similar to the Shadow Moses incident of Metal Gear Solid.
The antagonists this time around are primarily the members of Black Chamber, a US Special Ops team that has gone rogue and become mercenaries. According to the game's story, they were the replacement for Foxhound, so they all have ridiculous animal code names too. While the PlayStation version gave us names like Decoy Octopus and Psycho Mantis, here we have Marionette Owl and Pyro Bison, among others. The gameplay is more or less exactly like Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2. It's a 2D top-down affair, though this game does scroll instead of moving screen to screen like the MSX games. Just as in the PS1 version, Snake can use an item and a weapon at the same time. He can run and crawl, he can press himself against walls to avoid detection, and tap on them to draw attention if needed. In fact, his moveset is pretty faithfully ported over to a system with a lot less power than the PlayStation. The odd thing here is that the game is broken up into stages, which isn't a terrible idea for a handheld, and other handheld entries in the series would do the same years later, but it's a bit jarring if you're used to most of the other games in the series. Even the earlier ones this game is more closely imitating. This stage structure means that backtracking is much less prevalent than in the PS1 version. The game becomes a lot more linear. The stages themselves are mostly fine, but some feel like padding. Tedious padding. I'm thinking in particular about the conveyor belt maze. You have 3 boxes you can use to navigate the sorting system on these conveyor belts, and you end up having to go through it multiple times to get all of the gear and boxes needed to reach the end, and by the time it was over, I was so incredibly bored with it and wanted nothing more than to move on to the next mission. Also, while I'm being critical, I do have to say the bosses are fine, but they're definitely not up to snuff for Metal Gear bosses. For example, the first boss, Slasher Hawk, you throw grenades at him over a wall. That's it. There's no deeper strategy or extra tools. Even the later bosses, you typically just shoot at them. I have to give props to the team for trying to replicate some of the moments in the PlayStation game, like fighting a helicopter, and the fight against Metal Gear itself has some cool stuff going on, but for the most part, these fights are pretty flat. I really need to talk about this rating for a minute, too. This game is rated E for everyone in North America. This is a game in which the main character is a legendary killer, and that gets brought up all the time. The political commentary is back in this one too, with many of the same themes surprisingly, but even greater focus on not just interventionism, but colonialism specifically. There's a sequence where Chris expresses concerns to Snake about if her presence in Delta Force is enabling colonialism in places like Gindra. That's sure for everyone. Though the rating probably contributed to my favorite weird change here. Snake no longer smokes to see infrared beams. He has a thing called a fogger.
We get it, Snake. You vape.
The final thing I need to hit on is the writing and the cutscenes. Once again, this stuff is out of control, especially for a handheld that came out before things like sleep or suspend modes. The cutscene art generally looks great, but everyone is just so chatty. And just like the main entries in the series, every boss gets a weepy death monologue about how they're not really such a bad person, in spite of working for people who want to use nukes on innocent civilians. And the worst part about the cutscenes, they're unskippable. So when you die on a boss, you get shot back to before their intro soliloquy cutscene, and let me tell you, by the end of the game, they're getting pretty long. So you have to sit through them again and again if you keep losing a tough boss fight.
Overall, the game plays well for the most part, and it definitely feels like Metal Gear. The graphics are fantastic for the Game Boy Color, and the music is catchy and suits the mood very well. Though ultimately it is not quite up to the same level as the main entries in the series. Now, let's go ahead and do like we always do, and even though it is clearly no contest, let's take a look and a listen side by side.
The music in both is solid, though obviously much more primitive on the GBC. As for visuals, they both look fantastic for their respective hardware.
And that makes it time to give the edge. And, well, you're probably expecting this, but it's definitely the PS1 version. It has aged a bit, yes, but it's still fun to play, and it is an important milestone in the history of 3D games. The Game Boy Color version is arguably one of the best games on that platform, but let's be honest, Game Boy Color is not exactly in a fight to be the best library in the history of video games. I would say series diehards only need apply for that version, which is probably for the best because it's getting a little pricey these days at 30 to 50 bucks for a bare cart. And that does it. Thank you so much for watching, and come back next month because we will be returning to and finishing off the Mega Maniversary. See you then.
Listen up. This is an extremely sensitive covert operation. You'll be one man against an entire squad of high-tech special ops. They will be armed, and they will be dangerous. If you want to survive, you gotta have brains. You have to be in peak physical condition. You have to have nerves of steel. The fate of the free world is in your hands, soldier. Failure is not an option.
Sir, aren't these tests kind of easy?
Suicide mission.
Oh.